So in this video, we're going to look at how we can elongate an existing path by adding an additional control point to the spline along with an additional gizmo. So the way that we can do that is we go to our tool, pathfinding tool here. We're going to look at some new kinds of events. So we've got a shutdown event, which I'll just wrap up here. So shutdown. There we go. We've got our shutdown event. We've got our instantiation sequence. I'm just going to change the size of some of this font here. So we've got shutdown. We've got our instantiation. Even go up to, let's go 80. There we go. Let's go up to 80 here too. So we've got our shutdown. We've got our instantiation sequence. I'm going to wrap the I'm going to wrap the startup sequence as well. So I can go ahead and wrap all of this like so. Call this the instantiation sequence. Put this on size 80 as well. Make it gray. Set this up like the way I like it. Okay, so pull that up. So we've got our instantiation sequence. We've got our shutdown sequence. We've got our handling of the gizmo lifetimes. So we'll set this on 82. There we go. And this section down here can all be added, I think, to the instantiation sequence. So there we go. And then we've got our update splines. So this is our gizmo transform. Let's go ahead and wrap this as well. There we go. So we've got our kind of main blocks of logic. Now we're going to add another main block of logic. And that block of logic is going to be what happens when we're in the tool, we don't have any spline selected and we click somewhere on the terrain. So that's what we're going to be dealing with now. In order to click on the terrain, we're going to need to have a click event. And you can see that we've got a test if hit by click, and we've also got on hit by click. So let's go and add an on hit by click event, and let's see what we can do with it. With the on hit by click event, we can see that we get a click pause. So if we break that, we're going to get a device ray, and this is a ray in world. It's a 3D ray in a 3D scene in world coordinates. Okay, so let's break that ray. We're going to see that we get the origin and the direction. So this is taking the position of our mouse on the 2D viewport, and it's giving it a direction in world space as well as a position in world space. So what this allows us to do is do a line trace, and we're going to do a line trace by channel to begin with, like so. We're going to set it to start at the origin, and the end is going to be the origin plus the direction multiplied by some factor. So I'm going to make a float. Here we go, because we want to multiply by a distance, which is a single dimension. Here we go, a very high distance. And that's going to be the end location. So starts on the screen, ends in the world far away. And we're going to have an out hit, okay? So what we can do as well is on hit by click, give it a lifetime. We're going to set the duration of the draw to be for the duration, which is 5 seconds. And let's see what we get. We're going to run the tool, and I'm just going to go ahead and click somewhere on the screen. And we're not getting any results. So why is that? Let's go and have a little look at the output log. Let's try that once more. We're not actually seeing anything. So why would that be? Well, that comes back down to the test if hit by click that we had previously. So I think that event on hit by click won't work unless we have a test if hit by click returning true. Okay, so we need to actually take the logic that we wrote here, and because we're going to be using this in lots of places, let's go ahead and I'm going to pull this reroute out here so that when I collapse it to a function, we get the output pin. So I'm going to go ahead and collapse this to function. I'm going to call this world trace, like so. Okay, and we're going to copy the world trace function into test if hit by click. I'm just going to take that click pause, I'm going to wire it out, and then we're going to say we're going to break the hit result. I'm going to say if the blocking was hit, then we're going to make a hit result. Okay, so we're going to make input ray hit. Let's try that again. So make input ray hit, and then we're going to set the hit depth to be equal to the distance, the hit to be blocking hit true, and we could also return some of these other things, but let's just go ahead with, oh yeah, now hit, we can even go hit object. Okay, there we go. So we're making a hit event. So now let's go ahead and see if we can actually get that to draw. So there we go. now we can see that when we run the tool, we're getting these hits. And if you go underneath the terrain, you'll see that we get a green line. So that means that it's not hit anything up until the terrain. And then after the terrain, it's returning in green because it did actually hit something. Great. So just to double check that we're actually getting the hit on the click by hit event as well, I'm going to turn off the drawing, or in fact, let's make the drawing be optional on the trace itself. So inside of the tested hit by event, we can say none. And then if we're actually doing the trace on the event on hit by click, we set for duration. And let's go ahead and give this a shot. And now we can see that we're getting the behavior that we expect. And only one of those world traces is actually drawing. And it's this second one after the event on hit by click. Okay, so that's the basic setup. And I think it's a little bit convoluted, but I think the test of hit by click is essentially an optimization that avoids having to run this logic if it doesn't hit anything. Okay, so we're saying if we hit something, we need to now check our selection. So let's get I think we can just say get previous selection. So this will be set to, if selected actors has changed, we're going to set the previous selection to the selected actors. So that means that this will be empty if nothing is selected. So that's good, it's what we want. And we can say previous selection, if the length is equal to 0, that means that we're not holding anything, so nothing is selected. Okay. And in this case, what I'm going to do, because this doesn't intuitively make much sense to me, I'm actually just going to collapse this to a little macro. In fact, let's even turn this whole thing into a macro. Okay. And we're going to convert this macro to be called has selection, or is selection empty. Okay. And we're going to say that the two outputs are called true and false, just like the branch. So we're saying if the length of the selection is 0, then there is no selection. So if the selection is empty, we're going to do a certain logic. So if the selection is empty, we're going to do a world trace. In fact, we could even place this before, so the world trace only happens if the selection is empty. So avoid running unnecessary logic. Okay, so we're going to do a world trace, and we're going to get the hit location. Okay, so this again, we could just collapse this to a little macro because it will tidy up the graph. So get hit location. There we go. And at the hit location, we're going to do a thing. Okay, so if there's no selection, we're going to do a world trace. We're going to get hit location. There's two things we need to do. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to handle the creation of a new spline. Okay. All right. So at this location, we're going to spawn an actor from a class, and you can see that we have two options. We have the game option and we have the level utility option. So we want to choose the level utility option. And the object we want to spawn is going to be a BP spline. Okay, so we're creating a new spline at this location. Then, because we are spawning the object, we're going to want to set it to be the active selection. So we can say set selected actor. And if you don't see anything popping up, you can turn off context sensitive, and you're going to see that we have a level utility function called set selected level actors. And this requires the editor actor subsystem. So let's also turn back on context sensitive and search for editor actor subsystem and wire that in there. So this, again, quite convoluted Unreal specific stuff, but hopefully useful to be learning along the way. Some functions are only available via accessing certain subsystems. Okay. So we're going to set the selected actors to be an array of a length 1, which is the object, the spline that we've just selected. Okay, so let's go and test this out. We're going to run the tool, and we're just going to click on the terrain. And we're not getting any results. So why would that be? It is because we are currently selecting the landscape. Okay, so if I was to click off the landscape and now click, we're going to see that it spawns the spline. But we shouldn't even really be able to select the landscape or anything other than BP splines, because it's going to lead to confusion. So that did work. So let's just go ahead and complete that without baking it for now. Go back to our tool. So I just said that we don't want to be able to select anything except BP splines. So the place that is correct to do this is going to be on script tick. And we're going to say that if, we're going to say that if the selected actor is not of length 0 and not of type BP spline, then we're going to destroy that selection. So, okay, so we can say get selected actors. If it's changed, we're going to update the selection. And then what we're going to do is we're going to, first of all, destroy all the gizmos. Then we're going to cast and check if it's a spline. And we're saying if it is a spline, create the gizmos for the spline. So what we need to add here is just a little condition which says if it's not a spline, we're going to clear the selection. Okay, so we're going to now actually use the same exact function. I'm going to set the selected level actors, and we're going to set this to be an array of nothing. Okay, so compile, that should be fine. No, we're getting an invalid array. So all we need to do here is just make an array with nothing in it. Okay, so we're saying that there is no selection now. And I'm going to go ahead and wrap this in a box saying deselect non-BP, non-splines, deselect non-splines. And let's go ahead and try this out. So running the tool, if I select the landscape, you can see that now it deselects it. If I select the volumetric cloud, it deselects it, deselects it. In fact, it's going to deselect everything apart from a BP spline. Okay, so now if I was to click somewhere else on the terrain, nothing happens apart from I deselect it. And now that I've deselected it, if I click somewhere else on the terrain, it's going to create a new BP spline. Okay, so really nice, interactive and kind of intuitive way of working. If I recompute, we're now going to get those two level paths. So you can see that's all working as it should. So we've dealt with the first case of what happens when we click somewhere in the tool while nothing is selected. It's going to spawn a new spline. So we no longer have to drag them out like so. And the next thing that we need to do is we need to handle the case where we have a spline selected and we actually just want to add a new control point. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and save. I'm going to go back into my tool, and we're going to keep working on the on hit by click region. So I'm just going to copy this comment block to save some time, and we're going to call this event we're going to click on user clicks. There we go. Not a very descriptive name, but it will do for now. And we've dealt with when selection is empty. So this is going to say spawn BP spline when selection is empty. So now we're going to deal with the case where we do have a selection. So is selection empty equals false. And we're going to look at how we can add points to an already existing spline. So we're going to start by doing a world trace like we did previously. And I'm going to pull this down here. So we're going to be tracing against the environment. Make sure that our draw debug type on both of these is off. We're also going to be getting the hit location. And the way that I like to imagine this working is essentially we are going to, when we click in the viewport, so I just go and grab one of these splines, imagine that if we have a gizmo selected like we do now, then when we click somewhere, if we click on the sort of beyond the spline, we're going to add a new spline point over here. But if we click on this side, sort of close to the spline, we're actually going to insert a new spline point there. And the same will be true if we were to grab the other end. If we were to click beyond the spline, we'll sort of elongate it. And if we click sort of on or near the spline, we'll insert a new spline point there. That's how I want this tool to work. So in order to do that, we obviously need the hit location, but we're also going to need to grab our spline. So in order to do that, we're going to get our previous selection. We're going to make sure that we get the first index, which is the only one we ever care about. We're going to cast that to BP spline, cast to spline. There it is. And we're going to do a few things with the spline here. The first thing I want to do is I want to get the distance along spline at location. There we go. So we want to get the distance along the spline at the location. So if we mouse over this, you can see that it says get distance along the spline at the closest point of the provided input location, which is really useful because it means if I grab this spline again, if we click here, then the distance in this direction is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or however long it is up until the end. Okay, so it's going to return the distance. If on the other hand, we click on the left, sort of beyond this side, then of course the distance is going to be 0 because this is distance 0 along the spline. Conversely, at this end, the distance above is going to be sort of the maximum distance. It's going to be sort of very high, and then it's going to count down from there. So we know the distance at the spline points, and all we need to do is say where we click, we're going to get the distance, and we're going to compare it to the distance at the actual spline point. So if the distance is greater when we click here than it is at the spline point, then we insert a point on the curve. And if the distance is less than, then we'll insert it, but we'll insert it before. Same is true over here at the end point. If we click to the right, then the distance is going to match. So we'll say, okay, this is beyond the spline. So we'll create the point there. And if it's less, then we'll say it's before the spline ends, so we'll insert on the curve. So it's very simple logic. Okay, so we're going to get the distance along the spline at the location, which is the hit location. And we're going to compare this. So we're going to say, is the distance where I clicked greater than the distance at the point? But how do we know which point is currently selected? Well, we need to go up to the event on gizmo transform changed function, and very helpfully, this returns the gizmo that was most recently dragged or is being dragged. So if I promote this to a variable, we can say this is the last gizmo. Okay, make sure everything's still hooked up. And what it means is, if we go back over here, we can get our last gizmo, and we can find where that gizmo is in our gizmo array. Okay, so this gives us the spline point index of the last of the point we're selecting, or of the gizmo that we're selecting. Okay, so next thing we can do is we can say get location at spline point. We want to set, oh, not location, sorry, get distance at spline point. Here we go, and this is the index. And we want to make sure that our coordinate space for this one is world, because we're doing all of our calculations in world space. So now we're saying if the distance of where we've clicked is greater than the distance at the actual spline point, then we're going to do something. And we could use a branch to do something, but in this case, we're actually going to use a select, and we're going to pick between two ints, and then you'll see why in a second. Okay, so let's sort out our graph a little bit. So I'll just pull this up here. There we go. I'll pull this down here. We've got our spline like so. Okay, and this is our logic, and we're selecting between two ints. And essentially what we want to do now, if I actually pull this up here, it's going to rewire this a little bit. So then we're going to say add spline point, but crucially, we're going to add a spline point at an index. And this is what allows us to insert a new spline point anywhere on the curve. Okay, so if it's a spline point, we're going to add a spline point at the position of the click. Okay, so let's pull this down here. Let's pull this up here, like so. All right, so we're going to add it at the position always, and it's always going to be in world space. So the only thing that we're going to change, dependent on where we clicked, is at what index we want to add it. Okay, so if we're saying the distance of the click is greater, we should actually set this to be greater than or equal to, is greater than or equal to the distance at the point that we're currently selecting, then A is going to add an index. So we're going to insert it after the current point. If it's B, it's going to be the current index, which means it's going to replace the current spline point, and that one will take on the whole new index. Okay. So that's our little logic, and this should mostly be working. So let's go and have a little look now. If we run the tool and I select a spline point just to make sure that we've got one selected, and then I click off in the distance. Okay, we can see that the spline got elongated, but actually it's kind of done the inverse of what I wanted. Let's just try the other point down here at the end as well and see if this one works. So if we click beyond, it's done the inverse again there as well. So we can see that something is very wrong. And additionally, we can see that we don't actually get the gizmos being spawned. So we've got a couple of issues that we need to resolve. First of all, I want to make sure that the gizmos are getting refreshed when I add the spline point. And we could try to go and add gizmos here and make sure that the indices of the array all lined up and everything like that was working fine. But it's a little bit complex, and there's something easier we can do. If you remember, when we do the tick event, we're checking to see if the selection has changed. And if the selection has changed, then we're going to go ahead and clear the spline, the gizmos, and recreate them all. Okay. And just as a little easy way to solve this problem, I'm going to create an extra condition saying, so if the selection hasn't changed, so it's the same selection, then we've got a condition which says, I'm going to put this for variable, I'm going to say force refresh. Okay. So if the selection hasn't changed, then nothing's going to happen unless force refresh is true, in which case we're going to go ahead and clear the cache anyway. Okay. And we're also going to make sure that we set force refresh to be false again after we do it, so that we reset that state there. So that's just a little bit of logic there that simplifies our life. But of course, we now need to go and tell force refresh to be true after we've added a new spline point. So every time we add a new spline point to the curve, we discard all of the gizmos and then we recreate them. And this just means that we always ensure that the indices are fine, are correct and match the spline. Okay, so let's try that again. I'm going to run the tool. You can see that it created a new gizmo for all of those points. And if I just click someone on the curve, it's added the point and the gizmo. The only issue is that it's currently back to front. So if I click on the side over here, in fact, it seems like there's a few issues that need to be dealt with the kind of the position that these things get added. So let's go and have a look at what could be going wrong. So we're checking the hit location in the environment. We're saying if the distance is greater than the position of the last gizmo that we selected, then we're going to do 1 and 0. So let's just try to invert these here now. And I'm going to delete that spline and create a new one. So I'm going to go ahead and just click over here to create a new spline point, drag it out to begin, and now I've dragging this endpoint over here, and I'm going to click on one side of it. Okay, so I've clearly mucked up something with my logic here. Let's try the one in the middle. Okay, so I think what must be happening here is that my last gizmo is not being set up correctly. So let's just double check what's going wrong. Force refresh needs to be false by default. So there we go. So force refresh was on by default, which may have been the issue. So let's go ahead and try that again. No. So going to complete that and go back. We've still got our last gizmo. We need to make sure that that's being set. Every time we move it, we set the last gizmo. Yep. Okay. So that's fine. Okay. Select int, get distance along spline at spline point, get distance along spline at location. The hit location, add spline point at index. We're adding 1. Oh, I see. I've been a bit silly there. So we're just setting the index to be 1 or 0. And of course, what we really need to do is we need to actually use the index and add. There we go. So we need to add that to the index. So we're actually making sure we're offsetting from the current index. So that was my mistake. So we run this once more. And if I click over here, we can now see that depending on which is the last spline point you clicked on, it's going to insert on either side of it. Now it's important to remember that it doesn't matter which spline you clicked on, because if I select this spline over here and then click somewhere over here, it's of course going to insert it there between those two. So that's worth bearing in mind. And now let's test the ends. So if I click over here, we can see that we can elongate nice and easily. And let's just have a look over here. And oh, so we get a slightly different behavior there. With the first index of the spline. So let's just do one last little check. We're going to say if the index equals 0, the first index of the spline, I'm going to make a bit more space. Then we're going to put in one more select. Okay. So if the index equals 0, then we're actually just going to insert it there in position 0. So now let's just double check that. So it works at this end, and it works at this end. I grab another spline point. We can insert on this side, and we can insert on that side. All right, so we've now got the ability to extend our splines, which is really useful, of course. If I go ahead and recook, that gives us a lot more control over where the path is going to get placed. But there may be just a couple more things that we're noticing now. It seems I've also kind of broken something here, maybe just a bug. It's created 2 of these terrain pathfinders, so let's go ahead and delete those, rerun the tool, and just hit recook once more. There we go, it's back to normal. And yeah, there's a couple of issues. So the first one is, you may have noticed that when we were kind of playing with this, we end up with quite a lot of points, a lot of redundant points too. So it might be nice to be able to delete points on a spline. And then the very last thing that we're going to do is we're going to make sure that our spline and gizmos always snap down to the terrain, because we no longer need we don't actually have any verticality to our paths. They're always snapped to the terrain, and it just introduces a potential kind of confusion when working with the tool. So the easier of these 2 things to deal with is the snapping of the splines to the terrain. So let's just go into the pathfinding tool once more, and let's go over to the event on gizmo transform changed, and we're going to effectively just grab the, we're going to set the transform of the gizmo, I think. So let's have a little look. Set gizmo transform, there we go. And we're going to get the current transform, we're going to break it, and we're going to break the transform that we'll be setting as well. And we're going to do something very similar to our world trace that we did on the click position, only this time we're going to be doing a line trace downwards. So as you can see, this is starting to get a little bit messy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to collapse this to a function. It requires inputs and outputs first, so let's just set those up. There we go. Collapse this to a function. I'm going to call this line trace or snap to ground. There we go. And we want to return, we want to set the position, so that's fine. And we need to also pipe in the gizmo. So the gizmo that we're going to be modifying. Snap to ground, the gizmo. And then we're going to take the current location as the start point, except we're going to add a value to it. And then we're going to subtract the same value to set the endpoint. So it's going to trace from up to down. And this value is going to be make vector. And it's going to be in Z a high number. So it's always going to find the current position and snap down to the floor. And then we're going to break the hit result. And if it's true, if there is a hit result, then we're going to snap the position of the gizmo, okay, down to the floor. And I'm just going to wire this up like so, and then we're going to add a return. Okay, so compile and jump up a level. So we're going to snap the current gizmo to the ground before we do anything with the splines. And let's just see what we get now. Compile and save. Go into the tool. And if I start adding a new spline, I need to deselect the current one. Add new spline, pull this out over here. You can see that as I move this around, it snaps it to the ground. If I click over here, it's going to straight away add it on the ground. I pull it over to there, it's on the ground. Just give it a little shimmy and shake. You can see the result that we're getting. And I'm happy with that for now. So the next thing I want to do is to add the deletion. So in order to delete a specific spline point, the way I'm going to do this is by control clicking on a spline point. So let's have a little look. We can see that when we have an event on click event on hit by click, we have these modifiers. Actually, I've set this already, but we don't need that, so I'm going to delete it. So we have these modifiers, and if I break the modifier, we can see that we have options for when we're clicking, are we pressing anything? And quite simply, I'm going to do a little branch condition saying if Alt is down, if that Alt is not down, we're going to continue as before. But if Alt is down, then we're going to get the, I'll just copy it from down here actually. We're going to get the currently selected gizmo and ergo the currently selected spline point. And then we're going to get our spline. And from our spline, we're going to remove spline point at the index that we found. Okay, like so. And then once more, we're going to force a little refresh. Okay, so pull this up over here. Just going to pull this along a little bit, and we're going to say delete last selected spline point. And this one is going to be insert new spline point. Okay, and let's just have a little look. Go, if I select this one and then press Alt and click, did something a little bit strange. Oh, it's added a whole new thing. Alt click. Okay, Alt click seems to be deselecting. So maybe let's try something else instead. Let's try the control click, because maybe it's just a weird thing with these in progress tools. So there's our spline. So I'm going to pull this one out. I'm going to then click in the middle to add a new spline point. And now this time I'm going to control click, and now it removes. Okay, so going to add a new one and a new one. I'm going to click here, control, click here, control click, and we have our ability to extend our spline and remove the points there. Control click, control click, control click, control click. And there's many more things we could do to enhance this system, but I think that for now, that's beyond the scope of this series. And I'm kind of happy with where we've gotten to. So if I go ahead and now just hit recook once more, you can see we have the ability to very quickly and easily decorate our terrain with all of these splines. We have the ability to go in and sort of fine tune things a little bit as well. So you can see now they're sort of snapping to the terrain, and it's starting to look really good. So I think we're coming pretty close to the end now. In the next video, we're going to look at sort of finalizing up this this behavior. We're going to look at what else we can maybe think about adding and create a little scene sort of showing all of this off. And yeah, I'll catch you in the next one.